Good morning. Welcome, everyone. Good morning to those of you joining from the United States. Good afternoon, everyone in Turkey and around the region. I am Defne Arslan, the Director of Atlantic Council's Turkey program, the Atlantic Council in Turkey. Thank you for joining our panel on the refugee question in the Middle East towards sustainable solutions, which I am delighted to be hosting in partnership with Ambassador James Jeffrey, Chair of the Wilson Center's Middle East Program. We are organizing this event today on the occasion of World Refugee Day to take a moment to think again about the needs of refugees globally and the millions of Syrians who had fled to, their homes since 2011. Life for the 6.7 million internally displaced Syrians and 5.6 million Syrian refugees hosted in the neighboring countries has become especially unbearable with COVID-19. Many have lost their jobs, and 70% of Syrian refugees live in a condition of total poverty. Obviously, women, youth, and children were the most severely affected. The economic crisis created by COVID has added to the already existing donor fatigue, which made financing long-term sustainable solutions even harder. I am not talking about a faraway story. I am welcoming you today from Turkey, a country which hosts the largest number of registered Syrian refugees in the world. And as we all know, these worsening conditions also made the job of refugee hosting countries across the region even more challenging. Because of the importance of this topic, migration became one of the focus areas of our work in Turkey. And we have been working through in-depth research and high-level gatherings to contribute to the policy discussion regarding the situation and future of Syrian refugees in Turkey. Today, we will have the opportunity to hear from regional voices, our distinguished guests, and practitioners on the situation in different refugee hosting countries. After 10 years of crisis, we are here today to think about the future, to tackle not only the humanitarian needs, but also reflect on sustainable solutions to help give refugee access to a dignified life, create resilient societies, and hear about some best practices. I am looking forward to the discussion and would like to thank also Marisa Kurma, Director of the Middle East Program in Wilson Center, and Pınar Dost, Deputy Director of the Atlantic Council in Turkey, and the whole team for their cooperation. With that, it is my pleasure to hand the virtual floor to Ambassador Jim Jeffrey, Chair of the Middle East Program at Wilson Center, former US Ambassador to Iraq and Turkey, and my former boss and former Special Envoy to the Global Coalition to Defeat ISIS. Ambassador Jeffrey, thank you for the opportunity, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Daphne. And for all of you who have tuned in today, welcome on the occasion of World Refugee Day. We here in the Wilson Center are particularly focused on worldwide refugees and internally displaced persons. In the Middle East program, which is sponsoring along with the Atlantic Council in Turkey this event, we're overseeing a region that has some 6 million refugees and some 12.4 million internally displaced persons. This is a huge issue from a humanitarian standpoint. It's also a huge issue from the geopolitical standpoint. It's not a surprise that President Biden raised this issue, and specifically along the Turkish border in Syria with President Putin yesterday. That's the extreme importance and criticality and topicality of this subject. So we're looking forward to participation by people who are actually working with refugees and IDPs on the ground, with our friends in the UN and my friend and colleague, Richard Albright from the Department of State. So now let me turn it over to our two moderators, Marisa Kurma and Pınar Dost. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Ambassador Jeffrey. Welcome again to this panel discussion. I'm delighted to be co-moderating today's panel with my colleague Pinar Dost, Deputy Director of the Atlantic Council in Turkey. As both Daphne and Jim mentioned, 10 years into the conflict in Syria, with UNHCR producing their Global Appeal Report for 2021, a total of 12 million IDPs and refugees, Syrian refugees in neighboring countries as of 2020, which represent, of whom 45% are children and 21% are women. This Syria situation will remain the largest displacement crisis in the world. The region is also home to 3 other refugee populations in Iraq, from Iraq, Libya, and Yemen, where the humanitarian crisis is also one of the worst globally. As Daphne mentioned, the pandemic and ensuing worsening economic conditions have only added more pressures on refugee populations, but also on host communities, primarily in Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey, that are shouldering the lion's share of this global responsibility. So today's discussion will most definitely address the immediate humanitarian needs of refugees and host communities, particularly due to the myriad challenges that they face. But also we hope to home in onto the long-term sustainable solutions, particularly in the case of vulnerable populations. This is not an easy feat, as at least 2 of these main host countries are suffering acute economic challenges, namely Lebanon. To discuss these matters today is a panel of experts and mostly practitioners from the policy desks and think tanks in Washington to local and international organizations working in the region representing refugees and host communities. I'd like to welcome Richard Albright, Acting Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary from the Bureau of Population, Refugees and Migration at the Department of State, Louisa Vinton, Resident Representative of UNDP in Turkey, Lara Shaheen, founder of the Jasmine Foundation in Jordan, Nancy Yamut, co-founder of Rescue Me in Lebanon, Jumana Qadoura, non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council here in Washington, D.C., and Bouquet Bahar Divrak, Deputy General Coordinator from the Association of Solidarity with Asylum Seekers and Migrants in Turkey. Thank you all for your time today. We will kick this off with opening remarks from Das Albright to focus on the Biden administration's policy towards the refugee question in the region. And then Pinar and I will co-moderate the discussion with the other panelists. I'd like to just remind you all to submit questions via Twitter to @WilsonCenterMEP or @AC_Istanbul. Das Albright, the Zoom floor is yours.
Thank you for inviting me to speak today. I'm really honored to be here. As we approach World Refugee Day, we're reminded of the strength and courage of millions of people who have been forced to flee from their homes. There are more than 80 million forcibly displaced persons around the world, including 26 million refugees, over 5.6 million of whom are Syrian and residing in neighboring countries. A decade into conflict, the humanitarian situation in Syria remains the largest displacement crisis in the world, with depths of suffering that continue to reach new lows. Refugee needs in the region, which were already incredibly high, have been exacerbated by COVID-19 and economic crises. In Lebanon, approximately 90% of Syrian households are living below the extreme poverty line. In Turkey, the country that hosts the largest number of refugees in the world, there is an enormous need for cash assistance, particularly for those not receiving monthly stipends through the emergency social safety net. In Jordan, 83% of refugees rely on the World Food Program as their major source of support to meet their needs. Yet a shortage of donor funding could mean WFP can no longer support them by this fall. We remain deeply concerned about the significant protection risks that refugees face. Refoulement to Syria continues, lack of access to documentation, negative coping mechanisms as families have exhausted their savings, and risk of statelessness to the more than 1 million children born as refugees during this crisis. After a decade of conflict, we must lay the groundwork for self-reliance and eventual durable solutions. Although economic conditions pose a formidable obstacle in the near term, Syrians deserve the opportunity of being able to provide shelter, food, and clothes for their children and their loved ones. Syrians deserve to be able to care for their families without being wholly dependent on aid. Strengthened coordination between humanitarian efforts and development programming is key to meeting the medium to long-term needs of Syrian refugees. Through better collaboration across the humanitarian development divide, we can jointly position refugees to contribute to host country economic and social success, become self-reliant, so that they can have hope for a promising future for themselves and their families. The World Bank, for example, has been a leader on ensuring refugee hosting countries have access to programs to accommodate refugees while supporting local populations. Through the IDA-19 window for host communities and refugees and the Global Concessional Financing Facility, the World Bank is reaching refugees and their host communities, including Jordan and Lebanon, with development approaches that reduce poverty and improve access to services and address medium and long-term needs. The United States also recognizes that resettlement in third countries is a vital tool for providing a durable solution for refugees who cannot return safely to their country of origin or integrate into local communities in a country of first asylum. For some refugees, resettlement is the safest and perhaps only option. UNHCR reports that Syrian nationals have the highest resettlement needs globally of any displaced population. The emergency presidential determination on refugee admissions for fiscal year 2021 took the critical step of restoring the regional allocations to ensure that assessing vulnerability remains central to the US refugee admissions program, reflecting the emergency need for resettlement across all regions and avoiding discrimination by type of persecution or country of origin. The administration is putting America's highest values at the center of our foreign policy in restoring our resettlement program. And Syrians are being admitted to the United States as refugees, and we expect these numbers to grow. Working toward durable solutions is even more critical now as the COVID-19 pandemic has left many refugees with even fewer opportunities to support their families. The inclusion of refugees into national services, including national COVID-19 responses and vaccination plans, will be critical to ending the pandemic. The United States stands ready to work with the international community through COVAX and local and international humanitarian partners on assisting with COVID-19 vaccinations in Syria and refugee hosting countries and beyond. We appreciate the efforts those countries that have extended healthcare access to refugees, noting especially the examples set by Jordan and Turkey as two of the first countries to undertake COVID-19 vaccinations for refugees based on the same vulnerability criteria as citizens of their own countries. The US government continues to share the views of UN colleagues that conditions in Syria are not conducive to refugee returns, and that refugee returns should be voluntary, well-informed, and take place in safety and dignity to the place of their origin or choosing. Forced refugee returns not only place innocent Syrians at risk of harm by the Assad regime, but also lead to greater regional instability. We understand the tremendous pressure host governments are under to care for their increasingly vulnerable citizens and the refugees they generously host. We remain unequivocally committed to supporting the Syrian people, as well as regional countries who have taken on the responsibility of hosting millions of refugees. The United States government's total assistance for the humanitarian response inside of Syria and across the region since the start of the conflict is more than $13 billion. The United States is proud to be a leader in the provision of humanitarian assistance, but we cannot do it alone. We call on other donors to sustain or increase their contributions to the Syria response to address the devastating effects of COVID-19 on food security, livelihoods, protection, and well-being of vulnerable Syrians and their host communities across the region. As Secretary Blinken noted during his speech to the UN Security Council in March, increased access and pathways to deliver food, medicine, and other forms of assistance to the millions of vulnerable Syrians still living in Syria is a US priority. We strongly support the UN cross-border mechanism, which currently provides life-saving assistance to 2.4 million people living in dire circumstances in Northwest Syria. And we are committed to the reauthorization and expansion of the cross-border mandate to keep the Bab al-Hawa border crossing to Northwest Syria open for 12 months, as well as reopening the previously closed crossings of Yarubia and Bab al-Salam. Humanitarian assistance must be sustained and expanded to all Syrians, regardless of location. While we strive together to meet the humanitarian needs of the Syrian people, we know that assistance alone will not solve this crisis. The Syrian people deserve a real political solution in line with UN Security Council Resolution 2254. The United States will continue to stand with Syrian victims of the regime's atrocities, demanding the safe, stable, and hopeful future they deserve. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Deputy Assistant Secretary. Hello, everyone. Greetings from Istanbul. I would like to now turn to Jomana Kadur, who leads the Syria portfolio at the Atlantic Council. Thank you for joining us, Jomana. As we also heard from the Deputy Assistant Secretary, we have been witnessing a strong US diplomacy engagement for the reauthorization and expansion of the cross-border humanitarian assistance to northern Syria, including at the presidential level based on news coming from Geneva yesterday. Under your lead, a new issue brief on this very topic has been published last week at the Atlantic Council. You are also the co-founder of a humanitarian organization working in the Northwest Syria. So please tell us from your perspective, why this is so important. What does this assistance mean for the people in the Northwest Syria? Over to you.
Thank you, Pinar, for the question. And it's an honor to be speaking alongside so many distinguished panelists. I fully, echo the many comments that Das Albright just made, truly about the importance of the cross-border resolution. As Ambassador Jeffrey well knows, this has become sort of a theme, a dramatic theme that takes place almost every year now. And unfortunately, is the only time where the world is fully, consumed and focused primarily on Syria. After July, I really do expect, unfortunately, interest in Syria to dwindle as we've seen in the years, past. But regardless, I think it's important to remember really what's at stake here. As you said, we highlighted this in our issue brief. Everyone is welcome to see it online. And as you mentioned, I'm the co-founder of a nonprofit organization that works in Idlib, both Turkish-held areas as well as the other areas in Idlib. We have seen, to see really the possible things at stake here. The United Nations has more capacity than any other actor, and it is empowered by all the donor countries in order to do its job. Now you have about 3.5 million Syrians living in a very tiny enclave in Syria that have no access to aid, but for aid coming through Turkish-held borders, whether it's provided by INGOs, the United Nations, and otherwise. Right now, currently, the WHO is leading the COVID efforts, and throughout all of that entire area. And so what closing down the cross-border resolution essentially does is halt even the WHO's response in Idlib that it's been leading really incredibly. In fact, I think COVID response in northwest Syria has ironically been the best throughout all of Syria because of access that it has to the United Nations aid. Now, the United Nations has a very unique role to play whenever it's involved. It has, the legal parameters to be able to work with any actor and to be able to do negotiations, whether it's with government or non-government actors. It is able to do that impartially in an unbiased fashion and able to deal with and carry really the legal risk that so many small Syrian NGOs are unable to carry on their own. So through the United Nations, they're able to fund so many small Syrian NGOs that not only provides aid, but simultaneously, empowers the capacity of Syrians to help themselves, which I think it has more of a long-term benefit along the way. Halting this, closing down this border crossing will immediately likely put many of these Syrian NGOs out of work. No one is willing to take the kind of risks that the UN is able to and legally able to take. It also has the transportation capacity that no other actor does. I mean, last year alone, I think there were about 12,000 trucks that the UN was able to transport aid into. I mean, for those who are unfamiliar really with the terrain, it's impossible to have that many trucks. The number of trucks needed, the kind of fuel needed, even then they're able to buy bulk quantities of necessary life-saving aid at a fraction of the cost that it costs many, that INGOs or NGOs have available to them. So really, I think, that practically speaking, those are going to be the important sort of implications that affect day-to-day life in Syria. But most importantly, I think there's one other thing, and I'm pretty sure Ambassador Jeffrey would agree with me on this, is that, this at the end of the day is also about ensuring that aid, we try to prevent politicization of this aid. Damascus has been trying to monopolize control over this aid in a way that has been detrimental to daily civilian life in Syria. And so Russia has been aiding it in trying to restore sovereignty to Damascus as the only legitimate actor in Syria. And so I think what the UN resolution, the vote, what's at stake is not only the lives and the health of 3.5 million Syrians, but also, showing that we do not, recognize that the Assad regime has control over all of these areas, and that we do know that it won't be able to deliver aid effectively to all those areas. So therefore, it is not entitled to all the aid going through Damascus. I'll stop.
I couldn't agree more with that. It's just that having had experience trying to negotiate border crossing resolutions with the Russians, they will demand in return their pound of flesh, which will be one or another concession leaning towards embracing Assad's sovereignty. That's their goal in all of this, unfortunately.
Thank you, Ambassador Jeffrey, and thank you, Jomana. So let's now focus on Syrians who find refuge in neighboring countries. I would like to turn now to Lisa Winton, resident representative of UNDP in Turkey. Ms. Winton, welcome. It's great to have you. So in its 11th year, we are talking about a protracted refugee crisis, which demands an integrated approach, combining a humanitarian response and development goals. Could you please evaluate the situation in Turkey from this perspective? What has been working so far, and what are the main challenges? Over to you.
Thanks very much, and it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks so much for having me, and to thank the Atlantic Council for the great joint work that we've been doing in analysis and policy proposals. So yes, as you say, it's a protracted crisis now, and protracted means that there's a premium on durable, sustainable solutions that really draw as much on or more on the development toolkit as they do on the humanitarian assistance. And in some, what we see here is that there's been lots of efforts, both by the Turkish government and by the international community, with a lot of good results and a lot of good practices. But as Mr. Albright has said at the start, there's huge continuing needs, particularly given the fresh stresses of COVID and the impact of COVID on the national economy. So, as we know, the refugee population here are still considered guests under temporary protection, but more than half have expressed a desire to stay. And so we see, really a protracted future that has some, implications of permanence, so that the solutions need to be adapted to that outlook, I think. What we do see emerging is then the risk of that sense of the lengthening stay, translating into the potential for increased friction and tension with the local population. So that's something that obviously needs to be addressed. It's already been said a couple times that Turkey is hosting the largest refugee population in the world, but I think that bears repetition because of the magnitude of the challenge. And I'm coming here fresh. I'm a very new person to Turkey, but for me, as a personal impression, the numbers of refugees here outnumber the population of all three of the countries where I've been stationed before: Croatia, North Macedonia, and Georgia. So it really is, I think, a daunting challenge and a daunting number. What we see here, and what has struck me particularly upon arrival, is the uniqueness of the Turkish approach and inclusiveness and generosity, that the refugees Syrian refugees are included in education, in the community, in public service provision. So there are now 830,000 children in Turkish schools. The 2 million Syrian refugees who are of working age have the right to participate in the labor force legally. Whether they can is another question. And as has already been mentioned, they do have access to healthcare provision and to vaccines, which I think is really an extraordinary offering here that's now being realized in Turkey. We see the rollout of vaccines happening very, very quickly now. And also that the refugees are not confined to camps or in a specific area. There is a large number in the southeast, but obviously refugees are all over the country. And the scale of Turkish support so far numbers up to $40 billion US. So a huge commitment by the Turkish government to inclusion, self-reliance, and what is here called harmonization, or sort of the inclusion in the life of the national community. What I think has worked well here, and what is the core of the UN approach, but also supported very much from the government side, is to combine direct assistance to refugees with a realization of the needs of the host communities, that really is sensitive to the pre-existing challenges. That here there are very high levels of youth unemployment and a very high share of young people who are neither in education or employment or any kind of training. The high degree of informality that pre-existed the crises, low economic activity rates for women, and some gaps in infrastructure and service, so that there needs to be a sensitivity and provision of assistance to refugees that the host communities also need to be, not to be left behind, as we say in the UN language. And this, I think, is the key to the, kind of the holy grail of the UN system, is that what we call the humanitarian development nexus. But this dual approach really addresses that challenge well. I think for us at UNDP, what we have seen work well, and where we have been devoting our efforts in the response, is to work in three main areas. And one is to encourage self-reliance of refugees through enhancing skills, supporting business creation, and encouraging employment from both the supply and the demand side. And one big focus there, in addition to vocational skills, has been Turkish language training. And in the last 2 years, we've seen 54,000 Syrians complete certified Turkish training and 72,000 participate, a big share of whom have been women. So it's working on the access to jobs and the skills needed to perform those jobs. The second area is in support to municipalities in delivering services to refugee communities, but also to their own communities. So to ensure that any investment applies on both sides of this equation, with a big emphasis on waste management and doing that waste management support in a green way. And the third area is what we call social inclusion, what in Turkey is called harmonization, which is to ensure that it doesn't become a zero-sum game where the host population says, you're stealing my jobs. So it's an effort to bring the two populations closer together, including things like training young people together in digital skills, in whether it's web-based applications or IT skills, in encouraging joint efforts in the local community to avoid friction. There are obviously big challenges, and as has been emphasized, COVID has really stuck a a stick in the wheel of making a success, but we still see as many as 2 million of the Syrian refugee population here are living below the poverty line. There's still very, very low rates of women's participation in the economy. There are very high rates of informal labor, which made Syrian refugees especially susceptible to the COVID crisis. I think 82% of households said that they suffered economic consequences from the COVID challenge. We see households increasingly relying on child labor with lots of children who aren't in school at risk. And we see a sort of big skills gap that we're trying to address, but still one that high levels of illiteracy, low level of local language command, and low skills. So a large share of Syrian refugees without even a high school education. So, and on top of that, you have the economic crisis that comes with COVID-19. So we do see a huge need for continued international support. We see a need to recognize the Turkish government contribution and that of the Turkish people. But we think that there's a way to use the successful examples that we and many other players have developed to see the spending that needs to be devoted here as an investment in resilience, and resilience on both sides of this equation rather than a burden. We see lots of win-win solutions here, and that's something we're eager to amplify, but really with a plea for big support at a time where the challenges have mounted dramatically.
Thank you so much, Louisa. And the focus on starting businesses, training, and capacity building, I think, is a perfect segue to our next speaker, Lara Shaheen, who is based in Amman, Jordan, but her story is quite inspiring as a Syrian who sought refuge in Jordan and then started her own business empowering other Syrian women in Jordan as well. So Lara, I'd like you to tell us about your story, why you decided to start this business. And I think this ties in perfectly to our focus today on durable solutions. Lara, تفضلي.
مرحبا جميعا. Hello everybody, I'm sorry, but I'm also listening to this. Hi, I am Laras Shaheen. I am one of the 25% that you were talking about who came to Jordan as a refugee because of the war, and what we have faced of challenges and circumstances as a refugee in a strange country. It was one of the reasons so I can support myself and help. I thought of this, which is based on empowering women in the crafts and manual crafts that she is good at. But we thought of changing these crafts so that it would be a product that meets the need of the market, so that we could support ourselves economically without, regardless of the aid of the associations and organizations for the Syrians. I faced a lot of challenges that we spoke about. So I thank you for this opportunity to speak about new challenges. You used to say that there were we are facing new challenges under COVID, especially that if we move from we went from we had this electronic.
One of the challenges is that as a Syrian,
I'm just going to interrupt everyone here because we can hear two interpreters at the same time. Lara, go on.
I was talking about the challenges when I find solutions to the biggest challenge, which is COVID. I have another challenge as a Syrian. I cannot use PayPal. I cannot receive payments. The other challenge, when I start training as a training company, I don't know, as a foreigner, or I'm not Jordanian, it's not allowed for me. What I used to do before, I was able to reach 1,000 ladies that trained with us, and each one of us started her own business. This is one of the solutions, but the challenges are bigger than that. This is some of the issues we are facing. The last point, I found a solution that was appropriate. At the end of 2020, there was an organization that helped that, and we saw there was a hope. So when the Syrian sees that he can work and make money in the host country, so when it was helped, there was a helping factor that the small companies can get bigger and absorb more people. So we were able to reach more ladies, more women who needed work, and in facing the biggest challenge that was COVID-19. This is
Thank you very much, Lara, and we'll get back to you soon with questions. Nancy, I'd like to turn to you. You are based in Beirut, Lebanon, and you bring in the perspective of a host community member who decided to work with Syrian refugees in Lebanon, particularly children. So I'd like you to tell us more about the work that you're doing, and then we'll get to more details with the further questions. Go ahead.
May I use my presentation, my PowerPoint? Is it
sure,
okay?
Go ahead.
Okay. Okay, I will share it here. So. Okay. Are you able to see everyone?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm gonna start talking about my first experience. It's in Beirut, Hayy al-Gharbi. The name of the NGO that I'm representing is called Rescue Me. So Hayy al-Gharbi is a place where it hosts around 3,500 people between Syrian refugees, Palestinians, and Lebanese, and it's adjacent and next to Sabra and Shatila camp. So it's not.
بذلك هو ليس في
It's next to it.
Can I ask again, interpreter to
stop because I speak English?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So there's a lot. The first time, the first people who came to Hayy al-Gharbi from the refugees, they came to an area where it's known for human trafficking, gangs, prostitution, and so on. So since my NGO works also in crime prevention, so we wanted to come in to do our intervention and change things related to vocational training, women empowerment, and dealing with children with trauma. So first of all, when Syrian children and Syrian children and Lebanese stayed in the same school, there was a lot of bullying because the accent was different from the Syrian when they first came. The level of education, it was different. So the bullying was started there. So sharpeners blades were started as children slashing each other. They even broke the ruler and used it as a knife to slash each other. So what we have done is we brought all those children to a different school. They were in a public school, so we brought them together and we worked in conflict resolution and peace building. They couldn't sit next to each other. Syrians and Lebanese children refused to sit next to each other. At the end of the program, because there was Mondial and there was like football happening, you couldn't recognize Syrians from Lebanese while they were wearing the flags and playing soccer together. But the bullying and the conflict was so high at the beginning that it was really annoying and it's really alarming. So this is where we did our first intervention with children. So we use multidisciplinary approaches, multidisciplinary program for children and their parents. Challenges that we have faced because we had a lot of, we had some children who were trained under Nusra Frontiers. They were in boot camps, unfortunately, and there was 2 children. I removed their eyes so we don't abuse children in the pictures. And they wanted to do journalism, so we bought them a famous journalist, and they wrote their first journalist paper under. They named it the Sun Times journalist, and they were a dropout. So we put, and now they are integrated, and they came back to school back again. So we did a lot of conflict resolution and peace building between both the host community and Syrian refugees. So we wanted to go even further in the area. So we engaged youth. So we recruited around 60 youth between the age of 15 to 25. Both children, both young youth did vocational training. Even ladies went to learn to have an idea about reconstruction, electricity. They were like treated equally as men, and even men they introduced to embroidery. So they were introduced even to mosaic. So both genders introduced to different type of vocational training, because we cannot say one size fits all, because not everybody likes the same thing. So we introduce them to many things for vocational training for them to choose. Then the surprising thing is when we finished the training, some of them gathered themselves, some youth gathered themselves and started to work, and they did their own company, like a small company, putting a male, for instance, or a female Lebanese, so they can get the official papers, and they go from there so they can do their work. Some of them, they didn't like all the program. So what did they like from the program is leadership. So we took some of the youth who like leadership and enrolled them with Right to Play. It's an international NGO where they did leadership. So we cannot force the youth or children what they like or dislike. So because we wanted to continue the program, we couldn't continue the program. We shifted youth who are interested in leadership to other international NGOs or local NGOs to give what they have learned to other Syrian refugees. As for women empowerment was really challenging. It wasn't easy to do doll therapy, and also they need to do dolls and handcraft and sell it to the market. It was kind of challenging because the women that I have trained with the team, they came from Membis, they came from a closed community, and it wasn't easy for them to engage and to have a new concept of leadership, new concept of women empowerment. It took us a lot of time for them to engage and to express their feelings and ideas about it. As for children, to be honest, we used many programs that was available, like cognitive behavioral therapy, NLP, psychosocial support, you can name it, and we failed for 2 years. Then we found a way where we can engage cognitive behavioral therapy and other type of treatment to work with traumatized children. And the blast of Beirut didn't make things easy at all, because you're working with a different type of trauma, like you're accumulating trauma over trauma over trauma, plus they are living in a devastated, horrible area. So it took us a lot of time to change, but they changed. They decided to change after really consistent working program. So we have found the following, that to work in future with children, youth, or women is we need to blend psychosocial support with socioeconomic together for those people to especially for Syrian migrants and Lebanese to move forward. We need to do livelihood, entrepreneurship, also agricultural manufacturing, because we have a lot of spaces in Bekaa area, which is an agricultural area, and people who are in that area are coming to the city. They're leaving a lot of spaces where we can benefit from as Lebanese and Syrians at the same time. Plus, I'm talking about livelihood, agriculture, handcraft, and construction. Those are the businesses that Syrians are allowed to work under the Lebanese constitution. But I guess if we can do entrepreneurship or small businesses between Syrians and Lebanese, we can survive what's coming next in Lebanon, unfortunately, and what's happening right now in Syria. So thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Nancy, for this comprehensive picture. I would like to remind our viewers to send us their questions via Twitter using the hashtag World Refugee Day 2021 by tweeting at AC_Istanbul and at Wilson Center MEP. So let's go back to Turkey now, and let's continue with the situation of children. I have a question for Buket Bahar Devrak from Assam, a leading NGO working with asylum seekers and migrants. Buket joins us from Ankara today. Thank you for being with us, Buket. As you know, almost half of the 3.6 million Syrians living in Turkey are children below 18 years old. And their education is obviously one of the most important issues. And there's a widespread reference to the risk of lost generation for Syrian children. How has COVID-19 changed the concept of being out of school? We shortly heard from Ms. Winton about the situation of the school enrollment, but if you could also a little bit give us some more details on this, we would greatly appreciate. Thank you.
Thank you, Pinar, and I would like to express my thanks to Atlantic Council Turkey and Wilson Center for organizing this outstanding panel and their kind invitation. I'm very happy to be here on behalf of Assam from Turkey. Before answering the question, the previous speakers already mentioned some figures, but let me briefly put some more. Today, Turkey hosts about 3.6 million Syrian refugees under temporary protection. And in addition to Syrians, we have about more than 400,000 non-Syrian asylum seekers and refugees in Turkey, mainly from the Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, Somalia, and many other nationalities. So these figures make Turkey the country having the largest refugee population. And among the Syrians, about 1.7 million of them are children under the age of 18, and about more than 500,000 are under the age of 5, meaning that they born in Turkey. So in other words, as the years passed, today, this year is the 11th year of the influx, these newborn children have no emotional, economical, or let's say in brackets, the historical ties with their home country, but they born in Turkey, they born in a society, in the Turkish society. And among the refugee population, the Syrians, women and the children constitutes nearly 75% of the total population. And as Louisa mentioned, almost 98% and are living in the urban areas, and we call them as urban refugees all around Turkey. So meaning that less than 2% are living in the temporary accommodation centers, or let's say camp areas. So the protecting the Syrian children against the risk of being members of a lost generation and enabling them to equally benefit from the social, economic, educational, and health opportunities is one of the important issues for the main actors of the refugee response in Turkey, starting with the government of Turkey, the public authorities, UN agencies, and the all international community, as well as the national NGOs like us. So since the beginning of the crisis, lots of efforts have been put and large-scale programs have been implemented by the Turkish government, and more than 700,000 Syrian and other refugee children are now enrolled in the Turkish education system. But however, on the other hand, the 400,000 children still remain out of school. So these children and adolescents are particularly vulnerable and at risk of isolation, discrimination, child labor, and early and forced child marriage. So many also require special support to adjust to the learning environment after having been out of school for several years. So in addition to the projects implemented under the coordination of Ministry of National Education, such as accelerated learning program, Turkish language courses, the PIC test program. As Assam, we are cooperating with UNICEF in Turkey and implementing a huge program named the Support for School Enrollment in 8 provinces across the Turkey. Of course, as you asked, the COVID-19 has severe impacts on the refugee children's access to education. Overall, we can say that the COVID-19 deteriorated the situation with the economic slowdown, deepened the multidimensional poverty, and increased the inequalities, which increased the vulnerabilities of the host community and the refugees in general. In order to better understand the impacts of the pandemic, we conducted a research very recently, which focuses on some key aspects like basic needs, well-being and socio-social situation, the education, health of the refugee children and their families. And according to the research, due to the pandemic, 71% of the families' income reduced, while 20% of them totally lost their sources of income. And 38% of the school-age children cannot attend to their education regularly due to the pandemic. Also, 90% of the children access the distance education that is provided by Ministry of National Education in Turkey via mobile phones and lack of computer and other devices. So, and 15% of the refugee children cannot continue their education due to health problems right now, and 15% of the refugee children work at an income generating activity, meaning that close far away, from the education. These findings shows that the refugee children who are already in vulnerable situation due to the migration and who are trying to cope with many challenges are become more vulnerable due to the pandemic. And with the introduction of the distance education system and changing the circumstances, they are at risk of drifting away from the education. So they are now more at risk of with negative coping mechanisms like child labor, and I said the child marriage. So it has also become a very important issue and a necessity perhaps to reassess and to discuss of being out of school, access to education concepts actually, because the digital deprivation, distance education, face-to-face education concepts are now in our agenda. So due to the pandemic, so we have to define what is being out of school actually, because schools are closed in Turkey for a long period, in some days of the week, some of the levels like the primary schools or elementary schools are open, but most of the children didn't go to the school due to the health risks and so forth. So the concepts of being out of school, access to education should be rediscussed with the experts, with the policymakers, and actually we have to define new and more comprehensive policy and financial instruments for the coming days and maybe months. And as Assam, during the pandemic, with the partnership of UNICEF and our public authorities in Turkey, we have reached more than 50,000 refugee children in the last 1 year, and we offered some counseling services for these groups for thousands of time. And we provide some school kits and help them through access to the distant education system, as well as psychosocial support and child protection activities. I think this is all for now for your question. We will be again for the next month.
Great, thank you so much, Buket. I'm going to turn back to Das Albright and ask the first question about the United States taking the lead again in the international community, like sort of re-emerging as a more active player in addressing the refugee challenge. How can the US do that, particularly given donor fatigue? You've outlined concerns that in Jordan, for example, the majority of refugees who are living with host communities are dependent on the World Food Program, and that if not enough support comes in, that there will be no more no more assistance left by the fall or the end of the year. So how can the United States lead again? You know, Jomana mentioned that after every World Refugee Day, the issue of Syria and Syrian refugees pops up, and then it's no longer in the limelight, and there's again a loss of interest. So how can the US re-engage the international community to address particularly the most immediate humanitarian needs?
Marissa, thank you for that question. I mean, the United States will lead through by example, and the United States will lead through its diplomatic efforts to resolve these crises. We remain the world's single largest humanitarian donor. There is strong support across administrations, not just this one, but prior administrations going back decades for humanitarian response. There's strong support in the US Congress, and there's strong support among the American people. So we will certainly continue to lead in the humanitarian response, and diplomatically, we will continue to encourage other donors to play their role, not just traditional donors that we see all the time, but also new donors to address the just unprecedented humanitarian needs we're seeing across the globe. What we're also seeing, which is increasingly concerning across the globe, but also in Syria is a tremendous example of this, is the protracted nature of displacement. And given this protracted displacement, we can't just look at the response to the needs of these populations as short-term interventions to keep people alive. We need longer-term development solutions. And this is something that all of the other panelists have highlighted in their remarks. We need relief to development coherence, or the nexus as it's called, but we need to engage development actors. And I want to, in creating longer-term solutions, and I want to commend really the approaches, the longer-term approaches by many of the host governments and the development actors and the non-governmental organizations that are active in trying to create opportunities for people. And I think it's really important to think about refugees not just as a burden on society, but to think about them as consumers and contributors, because they actually add to economic growth. They add to economic development. The World Bank has done some interesting studies on the Syrian refugee population in this regard, highlighting the degree to which they have increased GDP in the host countries through their consumption, through the assistance that we provide, but also through their entrepreneurship and their activity. And so the more that we can encourage governments to allow them to work and to contribute and to create, and they will be taxpayers, they will be contributing to revenue, the more sustainable solutions that we can provide and give them the dignity of sustaining themselves and their families. So I think that is really the direction that we need to go. And we have some really energetic organizations here with us today that are very much involved in doing just that. Thank you.
Thank you, that's all right. Jomana, I have another question for you. So you are part of the UN-facilitated Syrian Constitutional Committee as part of the civil society group. So I would like to get your thoughts on how to invest in the future of Syrians while a political settlement and permanent resolution to the Syrian conflict are not achieved. Do you think, is there any way to develop some model of governance to provide sustainable solutions in areas which are not under the regime control?
Thank you, Pinar. So, I mean, outside of the immediate question of providing humanitarian aid to areas outside of, Assad-held Syria, so that's northeast and northwest Syria, the issue of how these entities function, what's available to them, et cetera, becomes a very important one. I mean, as everyone well knows, the Constitutional Committee has not really led to anything tangible in the past almost 2 years. It'll be almost 2 years in October. it was a process that really, I think the Russians very much pushed for. But what ended up being was a lot of wasted time and efforts. Not only did we draft no constitution, we also were unable to make any positive impact on Syrians' lives. Excuse me? On any Syrian lives, whether it's in Assad-held Syria or the northwest and northeast Syria. So the same problems that we had before this process only continued now. In terms of how to improve the daily lives of people. Now, during the Trump administration, the stabilization aid ended up being cut off. It was cut off, and shortly thereafter, we also saw European governments cut off stabilization aid as well, which I think has not, has played a relatively detrimental role, I think, in these areas that exist outside of the Assad regime. I think what we're hoping to see is a reinvestment in these areas, not just in terms of financial investments to once again sort of trigger, energize, local ownership of these areas and how they function. But more importantly, I hope that there is a review of sort of how governance is done in a lot of these places. Now, in the Northeast, we obviously, as the United States, have more of a role to play there because we're physically present. We have military presence there. We have partners that we trust, imperfect partners as they may be through the SDF and the SDC. I think that there's a lot of pressure pushed by us and the Europeans for them to constantly improve their relationships and their treatment of the local populations, many of which are Arab and non-Kurdish populations. And I think that's something that is constantly being reviewed, and there is pressure from the United States and obviously from, I think, Turkey, as you well know, in terms of how governance functions in those areas. But in the Northwest, you see a much more disheveled picture. You have areas that are held technically by HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, and you have areas that are held by the Turkish government. And they function differently, they operate differently. Governance looks very different in each of those areas. So you have 3 areas all outside of Assad regime, all of which function very differently from one another. And I think one step, in addition to reinvigorating financial support for governance in these areas, is also trying to organize and have a more decentralized but organized system of governance that could possibly be implemented both in the Northeast and Northwest. I think there's going to be a long way before those 2 areas merge, but at least to be able to have them function more effectively, so as to provide alternative governance, since the hope is that the Assad regime doesn't retake these areas. So I think that's something that in absence of any political process, that's something that can be tangibly worked on. In addition to that, I think investing in education, I think several people here on this call mentioned it. It was something, education aid is it's very interesting because it's neither humanitarian aid, it's considered sort of stabilization aid, but at the same time, it's necessary, it's needed now. I mean, we're talking about kids that have not gone to school in 10 years. What that does for the future of Syria, even if the political problems were to go away tomorrow, is it actually provides a very scary picture. We have children that cannot read and write. And much less be able to process and critical thinking that will be necessary for rebuilding a country and a government later on. And you ask our friends in Iraq, and they will tell you when the war is over, that they didn't have Iraqis there with the proper skills, a sufficient number of Iraqis with the proper skills to rebuild the country, even though there was all kinds of funding coming in to do so. So I think there needs to be an emphasis on that, and I hope that that's something that the Biden administration can focus on, is really is doing that and sort of investing in the future generation of Syrians, given that we don't have answers for them in the immediate term.
Jomana, a few points to reinforce what you said. First of all, those areas that are not under Assad's control, the Northwest, the Northeast, and Al-Tanf in the South, are highly unlikely to fall under his control. There has been, other than some fighting in Idlib, which the last round the Turks won, there's been no major change on the battlefield in the last 2 years in Syria, and it's likely to stay that way. This posed a problem for the administration and frankly for the Turks as well, because neither the US nor the Turks want to move beyond security cooperation with their various allies and partners on the ground in their exotic lot. And various humanitarian and stabilization assistance and move into governance, other than, as you said, urging them to be nice to the various groups that they're working with. In the case of the Northeast, essentially the PKK offshoot YPG, and talking with the KNC associated with Barzani's Kurdish groups. But beyond that, there is an unwillingness to, by moving into political governance, establish colonies or alternatives to the sovereignty of the Syrian state, much as we dislike who runs the Syrian state. That would undercut the UN process. The core of that, as you said, is the Constitutional Committee. It's gone nowhere, but the reason it's gone nowhere is because Assad has not allowed it to go anywhere and Russia has not pressured him enough. But that in turn is why there is all the military, political, and diplomatic pressure on Assad and the Russians over the past 2 administrations, particularly under Pompeo and Kerry, the 2 secretaries of state that were most focused on Syria. What we don't know is what the new administration's policy is. They are focused on the humanitarian issue, but on the narrow issue right now of the crossing, as important as it isn't going to get the 12 million refugees and IDPs back home. And fighting ISIS, and that's important in the Northeast, but ISIS is running amok in the rest of the country. And that's just the tip of the iceberg of other problems. We haven't even talked about Israel, the Iranian missiles, or other things that torment us in Syria. The administration is trying to avoid getting deeply involved in an overall policy towards Syria. That's understandable given the fate of the earlier policies and the other things on their plate in Asia and elsewhere, but they also tried to ignore the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and look what happened last month with that. So we'll see.
Thank you, Ambassador Jeffrey, and thank you, Jomana. So I have another question, COVID-19 related question for Ms. Winton now. So we already talked a little bit about it, but could you please tell us from your perspective how COVID-19 has affected the international funding, with donor fatigue being an issue even before, especially how to ensure this humanitarian development nexus approach you just mentioned by investing in the future of Syrians to contribute to their protection and self-reliance, and especially for women and youth, while also benefiting, as you mentioned, host country and communities under such conditions. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much. I think, you know, funding is really a challenge. And I think what we see with the COVID crisis is that there's a real risk. I think there's a real risk across all areas of funding, but there's a real risk that the development initiatives are more socioeconomic focused initiatives that many of the panelists have talked about get left behind in just covering the humanitarian needs. And just to give you one example, UNDP co-chairs with UNHCR this regional refugee and resilience plan in Turkey and across the region. And the call for 2021 was set at just over $1 billion, but recognizing that the needs for development need to be increased. So the resilience budget was set at $579 million. But, you know, as of now, the humanitarian side is almost completely funded, whereas the development side is lagging far behind at 30%. So we really appreciate forums like this where we can get the word out that there's a need, you know, to redouble funding for all needs, but not to forget about the development needs in this COVID fatigue. But what I also wanted to say is that, you know, in UNDP, we've been doing a lot of thinking about how to respond to the pandemic globally, but also in situations like this, and to find the opportunities in the challenges. Obviously, it's a devastating era, but you know, we have this slogan, Build Back Better, which really means let's talk about green solutions, let's talk about digital solutions, and let's apply them for the benefit of refugees and host communities together. And I just wanted to share a couple of examples that we think reflect this aspiration, which is focused, as you said, as needs to be, on ensuring that we don't leave behind young people, that we don't leave behind women who are most at risk. So one example is we're setting up, next week we'll be launching a freelance working platform, a digital one, for Arabic speaking people, but with a focus on refugees who can provide translation services, coding services, web-based services that can, deal with markets in the Arabic-speaking world, but from the communities we face. And we see a real strong response for that also, can help us bring young people and women out of situations in which they tend to be isolated from the community. So that's one idea that deals with the digital, what we see as the digital future, what we've learned from COVID. A second one would be, I mentioned, the idea of supporting host communities with infrastructure, but particularly waste management. So in Gaziantep, we're just finishing the completion of a mechanical biological treatment plant that will not just deal with the fact that you have this huge landfill that's overflowing, but that will transform that into an income source for the municipality by, enabling waste sorting and recycling for money for the municipality, but also will generate biogas that will serve needs, help to fight climate change and pollution, but really yield a financial gain for the host municipality. So, and a third example is, there's been a lot of discussion about, businesses and entrepreneurship and encouraging that and encouraging governments to encourage that. So we've been looking both on the Turkish business side, with the idea of employing Syrian refugees, but also on the Syrian business side in Turkey, where there are around 15,000 Syrian enterprises that also employ Turks. But what we see is that there are information gaps on both sides, that the Turkish businesses are not aware of how easy it is to get a work permit for a Syrian employee, are not aware that the enforcement of rules on quotas, so that there's a 1 in 10 rule of 1 Syrian for 10 Turkish employees, that they are deliberately not being enforced strictly by the Turkish government in order to keep this movement going of employing Syrians in Turkish businesses. But also we see on the Syrian side that Syrian businesses have set up, they employ 70,000 people, but they've done this on their own with no resources, with no plugging into incentive programs. And there's a whole world, without plugging into finance, there's a whole world of existing programs out there that could be relied on by both sides to increase employment, to increase market space. So those are all areas that, with a little added support could be expanded dramatically to achieve this goal of what we keep talking about in UNDP, of resilience of refugees, but also of host communities. So we're hopeful that this will generate some enthusiasm for education, employment, social inclusion, and infrastructure along the way as durable solutions in this crisis.
Thank you, Louisa. And you touched upon a few points that actually Lara mentioned in her introduction that I'm going to summarize very quickly because we had some issues with the interpreters. So Lara was talking about her project that she started in Jordan, a small enterprise that employed Syrian women refugees like herself, who, like her, were looking for opportunities in order to continue to lead a dignified life. She talked about the challenges, particularly with COVID-19. And going back to another point that you raised here as well, Louisa, how they also headed towards digital solutions and as basically a way to address some of the challenges in terms of access to markets. And so I'm going to continue the conversation with Lara in Arabic and do the translation in order to make sure that we're capturing everything that she's saying clearly. So Lara, I want to invite you back in. You talked about the COVID challenge. You talked about how you went online for your business. How can the international community specifically support a business like yours? كيف ممكن المجتمع الدولي يدعم مشروع مثل مشروعك في الأردن؟
هلا بصراحة في كتير فرص جديدة ليتغير.
Honestly, there are a lot of new.
Can I ask the interpreter not to interpret? I will be doing the interpretation. Thank you.
بالنسبة للمجتمع الدولي لازم يصير يغير الوجهة السابقة. نحن هلا بظروف جديدة ومشاكل جديدة وتحديات جديدة، فأنا برأيي ما نضل عم نصلح القديم، نشوف شو الفرصة المتاحة الآن لمساعدة رائدي الأعمال الصغار. يعني أول مشكلة عم نواجهها إنه نحن ما في حاضنة أعمال حقيقية لأي رائد أعمال سوري، لأنه بالنهاية عم بيتعامل معاملة الشركات الكبيرة، فهذا اللي عم بحد نحن من إنه نتطور ونستثمر أكثر.
خليني بس أركز على هاي النقطة. So in terms of the challenges that many Syrian refugees face in starting a business, but also making sure that this business is moving forward, is the lack of opportunities for Syrian entrepreneurs to incubate their businesses. So the incubators are primarily for Jordanians, and it's very limited access or no access to Syrians. تفضلي.
الشغلة الثانية بعد التسهيلات يلي نحن أول شيء ما كان نلاقيها تحدي، ولكن هي اليوم تحدي بسبب كوفيد وبسبب تحول كل الأعمال أونلاين. فأنا ما بقدر بيع واشتري أونلاين وما ما بقدر سجل كسوري بايبال، لازم استعين بوساطات مالية.
The second challenge on going online is that as a Syrian, she cannot register basically through PayPal. So there are certain basically interventions that are needed here in order to help support Syrians go online for their businesses. And this is something that emerged post because of COVID. Go ahead. تفضلي.
الشغلة الأخيرة حابة أحكي عن حملة عملناها نحن بأحد كمان المشاكل اللي واجهناها بكورونا هو ازدياد العنف الممارس ضد المرأة لحتى وصل لنسبة 62% بالأردن، هي حسب إحصائيات الأمم المتحدة. فعملنا حملة اسمها الناجيات Survivors، فكانت ناجحة 100% بسبب التميز بالسرد القصصي الإلكتروني أو digital storytelling، يلي قدرت تكون المعنفة هي ملهمة لغيرها من المعنفات لتجه نحو التمكين الاقتصادي.
Shukran, Lara. And the last point that Lara made was regarding the rise of gender-based violence, but particularly violence against women due to the COVID-19 pandemic. The figures in Jordan have certainly risen. And so one of the things that her organization led was a campaign called Survivors to empower women to tell their story and inspire others to do the same, to raise awareness. And so digital storytelling was a very important tool in this campaign. Thank you, Lara. Shukran, Lara. And I'm going to turn now to Nancy. Nancy, you in the very end of your presentation, you talked about sort of a combination of tools that you think is essential for a successful intervention and for the success of your work, which is the psychosocial support combined with the socioeconomic training. What specifically do you need as a small NGO in Beirut? What do you want the international community to do to help ensure that you continue the work that you do, but you also scale it?
Rescue Me is not a very small NGO. We have partners all over Lebanon. We can target many refugees from north to south to east and west of Lebanon. The thing is, usually donors always mostly focus either on mental health or socioeconomic. They don't combine both. I want to tell you about even education. You cannot just put education alone. You need to put education with mental health, for instance, together, because we have a lot of traumatized Syrian refugees and they cannot comprehend. So you need to work on the mental health, like psychosocial support plus education. I understand we have problems with formal and informal education, but that can be worked. So if Rescue Me wants to work even further, we have a lot of capacity concerning entrepreneurship because we have done it, and I wish we can expand this all over Lebanon, where we can join the psychosocial support with socioeconomic through small businesses with Syrian refugees and Lebanese working together hand in hand in producing and marketing things online. We have the capacity to do the marketing online. So Lebanese people have language. Syrian refugees still are in the process of learning a second language, so they can both work together so they can expand it. And I wish I can take this experience all over Lebanon and to share it so they can solve solve problems, since we have inflation and things are getting unfortunately worse. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. So we heard from Lara about the situation of Syrian women in Jordan. So I would like to now move on to Buket now. And Buket, please tell us the situation in Turkey regarding women, how living in Turkey can be an empowering experience for Syrian women and girls. You can maybe give us some of the best examples of projects you have been implementing.
Yes, thank you, Pınar. As I mentioned, almost half of the total refugee population consists of women and girls. And the refugee women in Turkey, even though they have rights and services provided to them by law, are mostly passive aid receivers, and their dependency to the humanitarian aid is quite high. So being a refugee woman indeed brings additional obstacles. I mean, language and cultural barriers, not being aware of how the mechanism works in the host country, the lack of self-confidence to speak up, and so forth. And also the crisis situation is exposed to women to various forms of violence, human rights abuses, and economic instability. So to overcome these problems, providing them psychosocial assistance, protection counseling, awareness raising activities on gender equality, and livelihood support are essential interventions. And as Nancy mentioned, the integrating of the protection, livelihood, and social cohesion interventions is really very, very important. So in line with this perspective, as Assam, we pay great attention to empower the refugee women and support their role as income earners and entrepreneurs in our livelihood interventions. And one more thing that I want to highlight is that it's important to note that we cannot assume the women as an homogeneous social group, and it is valid for the refugee women as well. So we have the GBV survivors, we have lactating women, pregnant women, single parents, single women, disabled women. And so this heterogeneous structure and their diversified needs has to be considered while we are designing our interventions, both in the livelihood interventions and the protection interventions as well. So in terms of good practice, I just want to briefly give one example from one of the projects in Gaziantep, in southeast part of Turkey. We opened up a women-only center named SADA in Gaziantep in cooperation with the UN Women, ILO, and Gaziantep Metropolitan Municipality in 2017. It's almost the 4th year of the center. And within this center, we provide protection counseling, awareness raising, Turkish language courses, and some vocational trainings for the women. And also we have the social cohesion activities together with the host community. We pay great attention to the community-based protection approach in partnership with the UNHCR that we are having right now. So we establish some committees. Actually, the women are establishing the committees, and in the SADA Center, there is a Tomorrow's Women Committee, which is established by Turkish, Syrian, and Afghan women. And they come together, they discuss their problems, they discuss their commonalities and future thoughts. They become neighbors and common to each other and in the center. So the SADA Center also provides child-friendly spaces for these women so they can leave their children while they are attending to the Turkish language courses or vocational trainings. And the most important part is that with the skills, with the vocational trainings we provided in 2019, the women come together and they established a cooperative, women's cooperative. Its name is again the SADA cooperative, and they produce together, they sell them in the market. We help them to support their digital literacy and financial literacy trainings. And the SADA project is chosen as one of the most successful 100 projects in 2019 at Paris Peace Forum. And it's a remarkable and very important project as a success story in Turkey for refugee women.
Thank you so much, Buket. We have a few minutes left, and I know that Jomana has to leave a little bit earlier. So we have a question for Piras Albright, and then Pinar will also ask sort of a general question for last thoughts. But if I can ask all of you to answer in less than 1 minute. So Das Albright, the question is, if Russia ultimately does not commit to keeping the last humanitarian accessway to Idlib open, what steps will the Biden administration take in response?
Well, we certainly hope that the cross-border resolution will be renewed and expanded. There is a humanitarian imperative to meet the needs of the population in the northwest of Syria, and I can assure you that the United States and other governments and all of the humanitarian agencies will do everything possible to ensure the movement of humanitarian supplies to this population across the border from Syria. And we will be working very closely with the Turkish government and with NGOs to ensure that we meet the needs of these people. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I have a general question regarding the relationship between Syrians and host communities. So do refugees see their future in the hosting countries, and whether hosting communities consider a possible long-term future with Syrians? Would any of our speakers would like to share their thoughts on this issue? In Jordan, Lebanon, or Turkey? Yeah, Nancy, please go ahead.
If you ask Syrian refugees, there's a lot of Syrian refugees, they started to blend in with the Lebanese. But it's interesting that the Lebanese government wants the Syrian to go back to their country. But if we can do something between two countries, like I want to dream about something like opening businesses between the both countries and move economic to other levels. So maybe this will get, so maybe I'm dreaming much, but if you ask the Syrian refugees, they still want to stay here in Lebanon, and they are started to adapt to the Lebanese ways and the Lebanese culture. Only few that I have heard personally, they want to go back to Syria. So this is it.
Thank you. Buket or Lara?
Maybe I can add a few words now as well. I mean, the community, the refugee community, the Syrians in Turkey depend, according to the recent researches, their tendency to stay in Turkey is increasing through the years as the duration of the crisis and the instability in the region still continues. So many of the speakers mentioned that there are three globally accepted global solutions. One is the voluntary return. The second is the local integration, and the third is the third country settlement. So in any case, I mean, people are staying in different countries around the region as refugees under temporary protection or different status, but in any case, each day they live, they have to live in a peaceful and happy psychosocial well-being way. So we have to foster the peaceful coexistence of the refugees with the host communities in all of our interventions. Of course, in the mid and long term, everybody wants that the instability and the crisis in the region will end up, and we will look for a more bright future for everyone, every individual. But in Turkey specifically, we, the actors, the local actors, the national NGOs, the UN organizations, the municipalities, the public authorities are paying great attention for empowering the social cohesion and the integration between two communities. So that's all as my last verse.
Thank you very much, Buket. I mean, unfortunately, we are out of time, so we will need to end soon. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to Mirza Kurma. Thank you to our viewers. And with that, I will give it over to Mirza.
Thank you, Pinar. Indeed, we ran out of time. Apologies to some of the questions that we did not get to read out, but I can assure you from looking at them that many of the panelists had already touched upon all of these different issues. So thank you to Das Albright, to Jumana Qadur, Nancy Amout, Lara Shaheen, Louisa Vinton, Buket, Bahar, Divrak for being with us today, for sharing your thoughts and expertise, but most importantly for the work that you're doing on this very important topic. It was a pleasure to co-host this with the Atlantic Council in Turkey. We will be providing a summary online next week, and we hope to continue the conversation beyond World Refugee Day on June 20th. Thank you for listening, and we will see you back soon.